Russia launches a new wave of attacks one day after the United States and Germany approve sending battle tanks to Ukraine. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Air raid sirens sounded across Ukraine as Russia pounded the country, including the capital, Kyiv, with more than 4 dozen missiles. At least 11 people were killed, with buildings and energy facilities damaged. The strikes follow the announcement by Germany and the United States to supply Ukraine with battle tanks. We begin our coverage with this report from Louise Greenwood.
Thursday began with another dash to underground shelters for the residents of Ukraine's capital. Kyiv's mayor Vitaly Klitschko confirmed the attack comes just as Germany broke weeks of diplomatic deadlock by announcing that it will send 14 of its Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine to help break through the Russian ground offensive in the eastern Donbass region. The US was quick to follow, pledging 31 of its own M1 Abrams battle tanks.
The Abrams tanks are the most capable tanks in the world. They're also extremely complex to operate and maintain. So we're also giving Ukraine the parts and equipment necessary to effectively sustain these tanks on the battlefield.
In his nightly address to the nation, President Zelensky hailed the news as a breakthrough.
The more defence support our heroes at the front receive from the world, the sooner Russia's aggression will end, and the more reliable the security guarantees for Ukraine and all our partners will be after the war.
Russia has warned that the delivery of any Western military hardware will lead to an inevitable escalation in the conflict. Russian TV channels have been quick to mock the Leopard 2, with the Kremlin saying that all NATO tanks will burn in Ukraine. But on a trip to inspect troops, Germany's new defence minister warned that tanks may not arrive until the end of March. And there are signs that US deliveries could take much longer. That may be too late to stop the widely expected new offensive by the Kremlin, which Western military intelligence says could begin in weeks. Belarus has just released these pictures, showing joint aerial drills with Russian forces continuing. Mindful of the threat, Ukraine's leader has hinted that requests for other top-range military hardware could soon follow. As the country continues on a war footing, Ukraine has received an unexpected boost. With France's foreign minister arriving in the city, the historic Black Sea port of Odessa has been designated an endangered World Heritage Site by the United Nations Cultural Agency. With no sign of a diplomatic breakthrough to end the conflict, the fight to preserve the nation for the future remains Kyiv's ultimate goal. Louise Greenwood, CGTN.
For more now on the Russia-Ukraine conflict, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Rhode Island is Vladimir Goldstein. He is the chair of the Department of Slavic Studies at Brown University. Also with us, Klaus Lauris is a professor of history and international affairs with the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. From New York, Andriy Dobryansky is the chair of UN Affairs at the Ukrainian World Congress, and Pavel Felgenhauer is a defense analyst and columnist for Novaya Gazeta, based in Moscow. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. Pavel Felgenhauer, well, as we've been reporting, the United States and Germany have announced that they will be supplying Ukraine with battle tanks. This is President Biden. Let's listen to that announcement he made.
The United States, standing shoulder to shoulder with allies and partners, is going to continue to do all we can to support Ukraine. Putin expected Europe and the United States to weaken our resolve. He expected our support for Ukraine to crumble with time. He was wrong. He was wrong. And he was wrong from the beginning, and he continues to be wrong. We are united. America's united, and so is the world.
So, Pavel, what's been the response in Moscow to this announcement?
Well, there's a kind of two-pronged response. One is more domestic. It's about that these tanks will not really change much on the battlefield and will be eventually all destroyed by the Russian forces. And one more outside, for the outside audiences, that this is a very dangerous move, that it not only may prolong the war, it could also lead to an escalation, which possible actually nuclear repercussions, since Russia is a nuclear superpower, and some Russian officials, like the former president Dmitry Medvedev, who's now also still an important official in the Kremlin, say that this may lead to a very dangerous escalation, and Russia is a nuclear power. So that's more or less what Moscow is saying. But of course, these tanks, when they arrive, and the Leopard tanks, apparently there'll be up to 100 arriving from different European countries, or 80 or something, 80 to 100 by end of April, May, when the summer fighting season begins in earnest. And they can be very, if not decisive, at least it's going to be a problem, because of course Ukraine has also other tanks, Soviet-made tanks and Soviet modernized tanks, which it also received from former Warsaw Pact nations. So there will be a lot of armor to deal with.
Klaus Laueris, this was not an easy decision for Germany to make. In fact, from the reports we are getting, Chancellor Olaf Scholz and his cabinet agonized over this decision for a long time. In fact, the headline in the New York Times says, Germany's reluctance on tanks stems from its history and its politics. It was just a few days ago when there was that meeting in Ramstein in Germany, when Germany said no to tanks going to Ukraine, and now all that's changed just a few days later. What do you believe finally led to the Germans changing their mind on this?
Well, Chancellor Scholz was undecided. This is quite correct. Particularly his own party, the Social Democratic Party, is quite pacifist. And they are concerned that it will lead to an escalation of the war, and that perhaps the war will spread into Germany, into other countries, and they are worried about that. However, his coalition partners, the Green Party, the small Liberal party, they were in favor of committing Leopard tanks to Ukraine. In the end, and the German population, to say that as well, is kind of divided, with a slight majority being in favor of committing tanks to Ukraine. In the end, Scholz gave in to international pressure, also domestic pressure, particularly also pressure by the United States, the international community, and his coalition partners. But he had certain conditions, and the conditions were that the United States would be committing its tanks, its Abrams tanks, to Ukraine as well. And in the end, he got that. Biden agreed to commit 31 tanks. And of course, Scholz is concerned about past German history, that the Nazis, of course, were in Ukraine. The Nazis did terrible things where now German tanks are being committed. But it is clear that the commitment of German tanks only was done because of the Russian onslaught, because the Russians are conducting ever more ruthless warfare against civilian targets in Ukraine. That is what was decisive.
Yeah, Klaus, you mentioned German public opinion, and it is very narrow. In fact, that public opinion poll, which was conducted by Deutschland Trend, showed that 46% support the tank deployment, 43% are against it. There's 11% that are undecided. There was another poll that was done as well, which showed that Germans are in favor of sending the tanks, but they should not be used, according to this poll, to recapture Crimea. Are there political risks for Chancellor Scholz in this?
There are risks, but I think on the whole, his own government is in favor of committing the tanks. And as you said, as you just quoted, there's a slight majority of the German public opinion as well. Yeah, I think it depends on the warfare of the Russians. If the Russians started to withdraw, if the Russians stopped their ruthless onslaught, I think public opinion in Germany would turn against committing the tanks and providing the tanks to Ukraine. If the Russians continue with their ruthless onslaught on Ukraine and perhaps even embark on a new spring offensive, then I think German opinion will harden, and they will support the Chancellor and support the deployment of German tanks in Ukraine. And of course, it's not just the Germans, and that was one other of Scholz's conditions. It's an international Western coalition of countries who will commit Leopard tanks, probably 12 countries plus the United States.
Right. Andrei Dobryansky, in addition to that announcement about deploying United States tanks in Ukraine, the United States also says that it's going to give Ukraine its largest aid package yet. That package, worth $2.5 billion, includes armored vehicles, artillery systems, air defense systems, and ammunition. And we're also hearing that Italy and France will be supplying Ukraine with air defense systems. So given all of that, as we approach the first anniversary of this part of the conflict, where does Ukraine see it heading?
Only in one direction, and that is towards victory. We see the signs of 2023 as the year of victory for Ukraine. I think most of the action you'll see from Ukraine, most of the language you'll hear will be on the international front over the next 5 weeks. Leading into the anniversary that you mentioned, you will see a lot of action both in Geneva and in the New York headquarters of the United Nations as more and more resolutions are brought up, more and more votes by the entire General Assembly, as with the tricky questions of the Security Council. This is something that the world is going in one direction. You've mentioned a lot of countries that have vocalized as well as affirmed their support of Ukraine with this hardware. You're not seeing a similar amount from the other side, and that means that more and more Russia will be this bombing campaign we saw in the package before this. Less and less material is available for Russia, which is why they're going to switch over into a tank campaign in the spring and summer, and then they will probably lose as many tanks as they lost previously. So it's only looking upwards for Ukraine. The more international attention is focused on this, both on the diplomatic level at the United Nations as well as the military support we've all been talking about today.
Now, Andrei, shortly after this announcement was made by both the United States and by Germany, as we reported earlier on, as our reporter told us as well, there was this series of drone missile attacks on Ukraine across the country. What do you know about that?
Well, we know that the amount that they're doing on a regular basis is less than when they started this all-out assault from the air in October. I've been in Ukraine twice since that assault started, when these nationwide air raid sirens go into effect. This is something that, again, at the very beginning of this onslaught in October, when Russia started doing these bombing campaigns from the Caspian, Black Sea, and their bombers, the numbers that they're sending of ballistic missiles is less and less. The numbers of smart bombs are less and less, and we're waiting to see. We don't know of any additional shipments of the Iranian technology that's coming over to Russia. So again, Russia is reliant on a very small parcel of state sponsors of terror to supply it with more material. Ukraine has better partners, frankly. So if Russia keeps running out of this resupply, it will turn towards tanks, which is why the West has been focused on this tank issue for the last couple of weeks.
Vladimir Goldstein, the spokesman at the Kremlin, Dmitry Peskov, he has been talking about this announcement, and he's called out the West for what he calls its direct involvement in the conflict. Let's listen to what he had to say.
There are constant statements from European capitals and Washington that the sending of various weapon systems to Ukraine, including tanks, in no way signifies the involvement of these countries or the alliance in hostilities in Ukraine. We categorically disagree with this, and in Moscow, everything that the alliance and the capitals I mentioned are doing is seen as direct involvement in the conflict. We see that this is growing.
So, Vladimir, what do you read into that statement? And if Dmitry Peskov is telling us that, look, we recognize that we're not just fighting Ukraine, we're fighting NATO, what changes?
I think it's a very important statement. Of course, for time being, he said it probably to the West, but sooner or later, if these things escalate, and if there are like more attacks and more tanks and more planes, then it will sink into the Russians and the country as a whole that they are dealing with some kind of a repeat of this, French invasion in 19th century, German invasion. The whole Western world is against us. And I don't think it's very wise on the part of the West, be it Germany, be it United States, to put Russia to this realization. This is a super nuclear power, and they were going to, if push comes to shove, the world will be destroyed. And this is not just Peskov opinion, my opinion, whatever. The Union of the Concerned Scientists, just put the clock to the closest of nuclear annihilation, this is a serious matter. So if Russia indeed is pushed to the wall, and that's what sort of is being conveyed by actual activity of NATO. So on the one hand, NATO can be very happy that they are showing the unity, but this is a direct existential threat to Russia. So I think we're dealing with a double narratives here. For the West, it's a Russian ruthless onslaught, as Klaus said. For Russia, is existential threat. One more time, the West wants to conquer that. And I don't think it's, as I said, it's wise to put Russia to this realization. This country has more nuclear, warheads than any other country in the world. So that's where I think they're being pushed, and I think it's unwise.
Okay, Klaus, what's your response to that?
Well, no one wants to invade Russia. No one was thinking of invading Russia at all, and still is not doing so. If Russia stopped the war tomorrow, then there would be peace. No one is threatening Russia. Russia feels threatened by Ukraine, a very small country which now wants to orientate itself towards the West. But that is not a threat to Russia objectively. No one wants to attack Russia. Actually, the West wants to have very good relations with Russia. They wanted to trade gas and oil with Russia. So I think, that perceived threat which Putin sees and his people in the Kremlin is really just in their mind. It's not an objective threat at all. And regarding nuclear weapons, what would the Kremlin gain if they deployed nuclear weapons on Ukraine? They would destroy the territory they want to conquer. They would destroy the border areas of Russia itself. So I can't see that Putin would be crazy enough to even think of deploying nuclear weapons. It would be totally counterproductive.
Pavel Felgenhauer, in these discussions over the deployment of more weapons to Ukraine, of course, many people have invoked German history, they've invoked European history and what is going on here, and the fact that this is not the first time that Russia has been the target of these kinds of wars. And of course, it's not the first time that German tanks will be used against Russian forces, as we are fully aware. But if we look at what's going on the battlefield itself, we look at these tanks that are going to be deployed in Ukraine, the Abrams tank as well as the Leopard. How big a change will it be on the battlefield? I mean, we're hearing some analysts tell us that, Ukrainian forces with these tanks will be able to punch through Russian lines and recover territory that they've lost.
Well, I say this is going to be Ukraine by May somewhere, when the summer-long fighting season may begin, when the ground begins to dry up and you can go mobile in those parts of southern Ukraine and the steppes. These tanks could be, if not decisive, they will be important, because of course they'll be also supported by other tanks, by hundreds of tanks, T-72s and T-64s made in Ukraine, made in Poland, that are also some of them modernized. So this would be just the tip of the spear, the Leopard tanks. And the Abrams, when they arrive, and no one knows, maybe they'll arrive not to somewhere later on, but the Leopards will be there, and they have a very formidable front armor. And they could be the spear. They could, but of course, there's also many other weapons that are being supplied, and some of them could be even more decisive. I mean, tanks are kind of sexy. They are big, threatening, and the public and journalists like to talk about them. But there are other weapons, not so spectacular, but they are more important, like new missiles for the HIMARS system that will have a range of 150 kilometers and are rather cheap and very, very precise. And they could be a real battle game changer. So, and other weapons are coming up, and this is a serious problem.
Okay, Pavel, I want to move on, Pavel, to Klaus Laris, and Klaus, I want to look at some of the diplomacy on this conflict. The Russian ambassador to Germany, Sergei Nechayev, he called Berlin's decision to deploy these tanks in Ukraine, he called it dangerous. Nechayev said in a statement, and I'm quoting him here, he said, Yet again, we find that Germany, much like its nearest allies, is not interested in a diplomatic solution of the Ukrainian crisis and is bent on its permanent escalation and the unlimited flooding of the Kiev region with more deadly weapons. Red lines are a thing of the past. What do you hear there when you hear a Russian diplomat say that, Klaus? Are we looking at a situation of endless war, no end in sight, perhaps a war that could go on for years?
Hopefully not, of course. What the Russian ambassador said is clearly he wants to threaten the Germans, he wants to threaten the Western alliance, to basically put the fear into them not to commit the tanks to Ukraine. And from a Russian point of view, that makes perfect sense. He wants to prevent the tanks being deployed to Ukraine. But what really is required is, of course, a compromise solution. But that also means that Putin has to offer serious concessions so that getting together at the peace table, at peace negotiations, makes sense. And here Putin needs to offer to withdraw from at least some of the territory he has conquered since February of last year. And at the moment, Putin is not prepared to do that. Therefore, peace negotiations do not seem to make an awful lot of sense right now. Unfortunately, of course, what we need is peace talks and serious negotiations between both sides. But the emphasis is on serious, not alibi negotiations, to be used as a break to regroup and to militarily strengthen one side or the other. We need genuine talks.
Okay, Vladimir Goldstein, on this question of a diplomatic solution, Russia's foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, is blaming the United States and other Western nations for blocking peace talks. Lavrov says Ukrainian negotiators agreed in March to a neutral status if Ukraine received adequate security guarantees from the West. And for its part, Russia said that it would cut back military activity near Kyiv and Chernihiv. What do you, was there a diplomatic solution on the table at that time?
That's what a lot of reports said, but obviously what I keep on hearing is that there is some kind of conviction that Ukraine can win, and if you can win, why do you want to negotiate? So I think it goes on, and the more weapons are being sent, and as I said, Russians basically, they can't afford to lose. So it's pure escalation. And I would also want to add that Russians feel it, and if somebody feels threatened, we should take it seriously. We shouldn't tell them, I don't mean it. This is not done. When Khrushchev put nuclear arms in Cuba, United States felt threatened. Russians could say that, like Klaus is saying today, it's not a big deal. We're not meaning anything. This is not a serious conversation. This is conversation based on total ignorance of psychology, of understanding of history. Russians been invaded on many occasions. Furthermore, I would add, look at NATO's behavior in Yugoslavia in '99. They bombed it. They were saying we don't mean anything. For 78 days, they were destroying the country. Look at NATO's operation in Middle East. So to say that we don't mean anything is just basically lying into the face of the audience. And I'm kind of surprised to hear this from a serious person, statements of that nature. This is a serious matter. Russia feels threatened, and you don't ask the person or country which feel threatened, why do you feel threatened? United States have a Monroe Doctrine which claims that any activity in Latin America will be a threat to us. So the country have the right to say that we feel threatened, and other countries have to sit down and negotiate seriously rather than stuff weapons to Ukraine and say we don't mean anything.
Andrei, what is Ukraine's position on negotiating an end to this war? Vladimir Goldstein just raised a question there. If Ukraine is so confident that it's going to win on the battlefield militarily, why negotiate?
Ukraine is organizing around the fact that we need to prosecute these crimes. First and foremost, as we did at the end of World War II, the crime of breaking the peace. That is for Vladimir Putin and all of his military officers. Secondly, everybody who ordered in an organized campaign the terror on Ukrainian civilians, whether that's bombing the children's theater or maternity wards, whether that's the mass rapes across Ukraine, all of these people will need to be prosecuted. And that is what Ukraine is looking towards now in an organized fashion. You hear and you see President Zelensky's 10-point peace plan. I think many parts of it will be presented to the world to be dealt with individually, such as point 1, remove all military assets from the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. These are all things that the international community agrees on, as opposed to some of these flights of fancy of remembering history as if Russia is the only country that's ever been invaded. There are a fair amount of countries between France and Russia, and a fair amount of countries between Germany and Russia.
Right.
They too know what it is to be invaded numerous times by both Russia and other countries.
Okay, Andrei, I want to talk about something. I don't have much time left, and that is there's been a major political shakeup in Kyiv. A number of top officials have resigned or been fired. And the Ukrainian media reported, this is after the Ukrainian media reported a corrupt scheme involving food supplies to the Ukrainian military. What can you tell us about that? And is this purge that we're seeing in the top ranks of government in any way related to the fact that President Zelensky at the same time was asking Western nations for more weapons?
I think this level of accountability is something that no Western nation can even come close to, even at the hint of a first news report. There were 2 separate scandals. One, somebody being detained for an allegation of corruption. 2, being dealt with at the Ministry of Defense because in some people's estimation, from the media perspective, some food supplies were being overcharged, whereas some weren't. So it's a confusion as to how much exactly was being spent on some of this appropriation. However, again, I say, I haven't seen any kind of this type of accountability in any Western nation in terms of the quickness that the President Zelensky's regime responded, both detaining an individual and asking for resignations almost immediately as soon as this came out. So this is at a higher standard of anti-corruption than any other Western country, as far as I know, definitely at higher standard of what Russia does nowadays. So this is all good in terms of what the Western countries want to see from Ukraine, which is quick and swift accountability.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.